Chapter 1. The Christmas I was quietly erased. They erased me from Christmas without saying a word. No call, no invitation, just silence. A week later, my son asked about my house like it was already his. They thought my quiet meant weakness. They were wrong. My name is Marianne, and this isn't a story about losing my family. It's about the moment I stopped letting them decide my worth. Snow had been falling since late afternoon, the kind that softened everything it touched and made the neighborhood feel suspended in time. By early evening, the street outside my house in Naperville was quiet enough that I could hear the faint hum of the heating system settle into its rhythm. I sat alone at the dining table, where I had once hosted Christmas dinners that ran late into the night, plates stacked high, voices overlapping, laughter echoing down the hallway. That year, the table was bare. No place settings, no candles, just my hands folded around a mug of tea that had already gone cold. I was 61 years old, and for the first time since my children were born, Christmas arrived without a knock at the door. No car pulling into the driveway, no text asking what time dinner would be ready, no last-minute call saying they were running late. The absence was not dramatic, it was polite, almost considerate, as if I had been quietly removed from a list rather than deliberately excluded. I checked my phone more out of habit than hope. There were no missed calls, no unread messages. The last notification from either of my children was from 3 days earlier, a generic thumbs-up reaction to a photo I had sent of the wreath on my front door. Daniel and Rachel had both seen it, neither had responded. I told myself that families changed, that children grew up and built their own traditions, that this was normal. But the house did not feel normal. It felt like a place that had been left behind. I stood and walked into the living room, turning on the lamp by the window. The glow reflected off framed photographs lining the shelves. Christmas mornings when Daniel still believed in Santa, Rachel at 12 insisting on helping me wrap gifts even though she was terrible at keeping surprises. Thomas standing behind them all, smiling in that quiet way he had, already tired but content. He had been gone for 10 years now, and I had learned to live with that absence. This one felt different. I sat down on the couch and opened my laptop, intending to distract myself with the news or a recipe I would never cook. Instead, muscle memory took me somewhere else. I typed Rachel's name into the search bar and clicked on her profile. I told myself I was just curious, that I wanted to see how she was doing. The first image loaded slowly, then all at once. A long table dressed in white and gold, twinkling lights overhead, a familiar brick wall in the background that made my chest tighten before my mind caught up. It was the restaurant on Jefferson Street, the one Thomas used to insist on every Christmas Eve because it reminded him of the place where we had our first anniversary dinner, the one we had gone back to year after year until life became complicated and then shorter. There was Daniel at the head of the table, glass raised, Rachel beside him, radiant, her smile practiced and perfect. Friends and partners I did not recognize filled the rest of the frame. The captions spoke about gratitude and chosen family. The comments overflowed with hearts and warm wishes. I scrolled. Another photo. Then another. Different angles, same table, same laughter. Not one of them included me. My first instinct was to close the laptop, to tell myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into it. But something in my chest hardened instead of breaking. I recognized the feeling. It was the same one I used to get in conference rooms when an employee smiled too much and spoke too carefully. The feeling that came when the truth was being managed rather than spoken. I went back to the kitchen and stood at the sink, staring out at the snow. The house reflected back at me in the dark window, a woman alone in a place that no longer expected company. I did not cry. I waited. The next morning passed quietly. I made breakfast, I watched the local news, I folded laundry that did not need folding. The phone remained still. Around noon, it finally buzzed. It was Daniel. The message was short, practical. He asked if I had thought any more about the house. He mentioned long-term planning, used words like efficient and realistic. He did not ask how my Christmas had been. He did not say I was sorry I had spent it alone. I read the message twice, then a third time, not because I did not understand it, but because I wanted to be sure I was reading it correctly. There it was, plain and unadorned. The only thing my son wanted from me that week was clarity about an asset. I set the phone down on the counter and leaned against it, letting the cold surface ground me. It would have been easier if the message had been cruel, if there had been anger or accusation. That I could have fought. This was something else. This was administrative. In that moment, something shifted, not violently, quietly, like a door closing somewhere deep inside me. I began to see the pattern that I had ignored for years, the way invitations became optional and then disappeared, the way conversations shifted from my life to my logistics, the way concern only surfaced when something needed to be decided, signed, transferred. I had not been pushed out. I had been phased out. That realization did not leave me devastated. It left me clear. I picked up my mug and poured the tea down the sink. Then I rinsed it and placed it upside down on the drying rack. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the street in a clean, unbroken layer. I watched it for a long time, breathing slowly, letting the silence settle around me without trying to fill it. For the first time that Christmas, I did not feel invisible. I felt awake. And I knew this was not the end of the story.
Chapter 2. When my silence was mistaken for weakness. What followed was not sudden cruelty, but a gradual shift that took place so quietly I almost missed it. After I retired in 2018, I had more time than I had ever allowed myself before. Time to read, time to walk the neighborhood, time to sit with my own thoughts instead of managing everyone else's. I assumed that was the reward for decades of work. What I did not expect was how quickly my presence would begin to feel optional to my own children. Daniel was the first to change, though at the time I would not have described it that way. He had always been practical, even as a boy. As an adult running operations for a growing logistics startup, that practicality hardened into efficiency. Our conversations became shorter, cleaner. He stopped asking how I was and started asking what I planned to do next. He spoke in timelines and contingencies, as if my life had become a project that needed forecasting. Rachel's shift was softer, wrapped in warmth and compliments. She was building her brand online, cultivating a life that looked effortless and aspirational. When she visited, she began suggesting outfits for me, lighting adjustments for photos, ways I could be more polished. Once, over coffee, she smiled and said it might be better if I did not attend certain events, just until things settled. She framed it as protection. I heard it as erasure. At first, I told myself this was normal. Children grow into adults, roles evolve. But something in the way they spoke to me felt unfamiliar. They no longer talked to me as a mother. They spoke to me as a variable. The tension surfaced clearly in the fall of 2022, during what was supposed to be a simple family dinner. Daniel had chosen the restaurant, a modern place downtown with menus that arrived on tablets. Rachel was late, swept in wearing confidence like perfume. The conversation began with updates, surface level, rehearsed. I listened more than I spoke, noticing how often they exchanged glances before answering. Halfway through the meal, Daniel leaned back in his chair and said we should talk about the house. He did not ask if I was ready. He did not ease into it. He said it the way he might introduce a line item in a meeting. He talked about taxes, about efficiency, about how things would be simpler if the property was placed under his management. He said it would protect me, that it would make everything easier when the time came. He spoke as if the decision had already been made, and I was merely being informed. I remember the way my fork paused in midair. The restaurant noise faded, replaced by a familiar internal stillness, the one I used to feel in boardrooms when someone revealed too much without realizing it. Rachel nodded along, adding that it would reduce stress for me. She said I deserved peace at this stage of my life. She said that phrase carefully, as if it were a compliment. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I asked a few neutral questions and let the conversation move on. To them, my calm must have looked like agreement. To me, it felt like confirmation. That night, alone in my car, I sat with my hands on the steering wheel long after the engine was off. I replayed their words, not searching for offense, but for intent. What I heard was not concern, it was control dressed as care. They had begun to speak about me the way I once heard executives speak about departments slated for restructuring: necessary, costly, manageable. I had spent over 20 years in human resources. I knew that language. I had learned early in my career that when people stop asking for your input and start outlining your future, something fundamental has shifted. What they did not know was that I had already taken steps of my own. In 2020, quietly and without ceremony, I sat across from Kevin Moore in his downtown office. Kevin was a corporate attorney, the kind who listened more than he spoke. I did not come to him in crisis, I came with clarity. I told him I wanted to protect what I had built and define what would happen when I no longer could. Together, we established the Caldwell Futures Trust. I transferred assets thoughtfully, deliberately, not to punish anyone, but to ensure that my life's work would serve values rather than expectations. It was one of the calmest decisions I had ever made. I did not announce it. I did not feel the need to. At the time, my children were still treating me like a person, not a problem. I believed transparency would come naturally later. What I was learning now was that silence is rarely interpreted as neutrality. It is almost always mistaken for permission. As months passed, the comments became more pointed. Daniel asked whether I really needed so much space. Rachel suggested downsizing would be liberating. They spoke to me as if they were already rehearsing a future where my voice mattered less. And still, I said very little. It was not fear that kept me quiet, it was observation. I wanted to see how far they would go if I did not stop them. The answer came faster than I expected. By the end of that year, I understood that if I continued to let them define my role, they would finish the story without me. They would decide what I was worth, what I should keep, what I should give up. That realization did not anger me, it made me deliberate. I began to prepare not for a fight, but for a reckoning, not loud, not emotional, just inevitable. When I finally lifted my eyes from their version of events, I saw my own position clearly for the first time in years, and I knew that remaining silent was no longer an option.
Chapter 3: The Life I Built Without Their Permission. I began by doing what I had always done best when the ground shifted under my feet. I worked. Not at a desk this time, not under fluorescent lights or quarterly targets, but with intention. When Thomas died in 2014, there was no pause button. Grief had to fit between school schedules, board meetings, grocery runs. I learned then that survival was not dramatic. It was repetitive. You showed up. You handled what needed handling. You watched carefully. For years after his death, I kept my position as HR director at a national retail company based outside Chicago. I managed restructurings, mediated conflicts,
sat across from people who swore they were telling the truth while their hands said otherwise. I learned to trust patterns over promises, tone over words, silence over speeches. Those skills did not disappear when I retired in 2018. They simply went unused for a while. In 2020, when the world slowed down and people began rethinking what mattered, I did the same. I scheduled a meeting with Kevin Moore, not because I was afraid, but because I was prepared. His office was quiet, shelves lined with law books that looked untouched. He asked me what I wanted to protect. I said, my independence. He nodded once and said that was a good place to start. The process was methodical. We transferred assets gradually, documented everything, defined boundaries clearly. Caldwell Futures Trust was not built in a moment of anger. It was built in afternoons of calm conversation and careful planning. I decided early that the trust would support education and community programs, not because it sounded noble, but because it reflected who I had been long before I became a mother. That was how I met Ava Lee. She was young, sharp, and direct in a way that felt refreshing rather than confrontational. She managed community outreach for a local education initiative and spoke about access the way some people speak about oxygen: necessary, non-negotiable. We met over coffee several times to discuss logistics, then philosophy. She listened when I spoke, not out of obligation, but curiosity. One afternoon, as we reviewed scholarship applications spread across a conference table, she looked up and said, "I like how you think about long-term impact. Most people want recognition now." I smiled and told her I had learned patience the hard way. That relationship grew naturally. She never asked what she would inherit or what role she might play beyond the work itself. In her presence, I felt useful in a way that had nothing to do with motherhood or legacy. Meanwhile, my children grew more distant and more organized. The confirmation came by accident, or perhaps inevitability. A mutual acquaintance mentioned seeing Daniel at a downtown law firm. I did not think much of it until Rachel let something slip during a phone call weeks later. She said they were just getting advice, that it was nothing serious, that they wanted to be prepared. Prepared for what? I asked. For later, she said, her voice too light. You know, just in case. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the lights off, listening to the refrigerator hum. I did not feel betrayed. I felt categorized. They were not waiting for me to fail or decline. They were planning around me, quietly, efficiently, as if my life were already transitioning to a footnote. I called Kevin the next morning. I asked him a simple question. Had anyone contacted his office on behalf of my children? There was a pause on the line, brief but telling. He said, yes. That was the moment everything came into focus. It was not about inheritance, it was about control, about timing, about removing unpredictability from their future by managing mine. I did not confront them. I did not ask for explanations. Experience had taught me that people rarely tell the truth when they feel exposed. Instead, I did what I had always done in moments of clarity. I set the agenda. I invited Daniel and Rachel to a family meeting in early January 2025. I told them I wanted transparency, that I wanted us all on the same page. The phrasing was intentional, neutral, professional. Daniel responded almost immediately. Of course, he said, that makes sense. Rachel followed with a heart emoji and a comment about fresh starts. I closed my phone and took a breath that felt deeper than any I had taken in years. Later that week, I met with Ava again. We reviewed the next phase of the trust. She asked if everything was okay. I told her I was aligning things. She nodded as if she understood exactly what that meant. You seem steady, she said. I was. For the first time, I was not reacting. I was directing. The pieces were already in place. The trust was established. The boundaries were defined. All that remained was to let everyone see the structure as it truly was.
As I drove home that evening, the streetlights flickering on one by one, I felt something settle inside me. Not anger, not relief, authority. And I knew the next conversation would not be about what I was willing to give up, but about what I had already decided to protect.
Chapter 4. The day they lost the story they told themselves. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in early January, the kind of gray winter day that made everything feel procedural. Kevin Moore's office sat on the third floor of a brick building downtown, understated and deliberate, much like the man himself. I arrived 10 minutes early and took a seat near the window, setting my coat neatly on the chair beside me. I had learned long ago that arriving prepared often unsettled people who expected control. Daniel and Rachel arrived together, their footsteps confident in the hallway. Daniel walked in first, coat still on, phone in hand, already mid-thought. Rachel followed, composed, smiling in a way that suggested reassurance rather than warmth. "Good to see you, Mom," Daniel said, pulling out a chair. "We're glad you wanted to talk," Rachel added. "Clarity is always good." I nodded and returned the smile without mirroring it. Kevin entered moments later, briefcase in hand, greeting everyone with polite neutrality. He gestured for us to sit and closed the door behind him. Daniel did not wait. "I'll just lay this out," he said, leaning forward. "We want to make sure everything is protected. You worked hard for what you have. It would be irresponsible not to plan properly." Rachel chimed in quickly. "It's about legacy," she said. "How the family is represented, what people see." I listened. I folded my hands in my lap and let them speak. Years in conference rooms had taught me that people often revealed their assumptions when they believed they were being helpful. Daniel continued quickly. "We've spoken with professionals. There are ways to streamline things, reduce complications later. It would take pressure off you." "Off all of us," Rachel said softly. Kevin glanced at me once, a quiet check-in. I gave a small nod. When there was a pause, Kevin opened his folder. "Before we discuss proposals," he said, "there are documents you should be aware of." Daniel relaxed back in his chair, satisfied. Rachel crossed her legs, hands folded neatly on her knee. Kevin slid a packet across the table. "This is the Caldwell Futures Trust," he said, "established in 2020. Daniel blinked once. "Trust?" he repeated. "What trust?" Rachel looked at me, her smile tightening. "You never mentioned this." Kevin continued evenly. "The trust was created to hold assets previously owned individually. Its purpose is to support educational initiatives and community programs, as outlined here." Daniel flipped through the pages quickly, his jaw setting. "So what does this mean for the house?" "It means," Kevin said, "that the house is no longer part of Marianne's personal estate." The room shifted, not dramatically, subtly, the way air pressure changes before a storm. Rachel leaned forward. "So who controls it?" "The trust does," Kevin replied, "under the terms established." Daniel's voice sharpened. "And who are the beneficiaries?" Kevin did not answer immediately. He turned another page. "The primary beneficiaries are the Caldwell Futures Trust programs, scholarships, and community partnerships." Silence followed, thick and unplanned. Rachel looked at me then, really looked, as if searching for the person she thought she knew. "You're giving everything away," she said quietly. I met her eyes. I decided where it would go. Daniel exhaled through his nose, frustration breaking through his composure. "So where does that leave us?" Kevin spoke before I could. "You are not listed as primary beneficiaries." Daniel's chair scraped against the floor as he leaned back. "That doesn't make sense. We're family." I felt the urge to respond, to explain, to justify. It passed. Instead, I remembered something I had said countless times in my career. When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time, not the version they narrate, the version they demonstrate. I didn't do this to punish anyone, I said. I did it to protect what matters to me. Rachel shook her head slowly. You didn't even talk to us. I listened, I replied, for years. Daniel stood, pacing a few steps before stopping himself. This isn't how families work. I watched him, recognizing the moment when authority slipped through fingers that had never learned how to hold it. This is exactly how systems work, when assumptions replace consent. Kevin closed the folder gently. The trust is legally binding. Everything was done properly and well within Marianne's rights. No one spoke after that. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. Outside the window, traffic moved on, indifferent. Rachel looked down at her hands. Daniel stared at the documents as if reading them again might change their meaning. There was no shouting, no accusation, no public humiliation, just the quiet collapse of a narrative they had rehearsed without me. I stood and reached for my coat. We can talk later, I said, if you want to. Neither of them responded. As I walked out of the office and into the cold, I felt lighter than I had in years, not because I had won, but because I had finally stepped out of a story that was never mine to begin with. Behind me, the door closed softly, and for the first time, I did not feel the need to reopen it.
Chapter 5. I was never alone. The next Christmas arrived quietly, without the weight I used to brace myself against. I no longer woke up in the house on my old street in Naperville. I had sold it in the spring, not out of loss, but out of completion. Some places hold memories so tightly that they stop being homes. I chose not to live inside echoes anymore. That December evening, I stood in a community center a few miles away, the air warm with conversation and the smell of coffee and baked bread. Folding chairs were arranged in loose rows. Paper snowflakes hung unevenly from the ceiling, clearly cut by different hands. Nothing about the room was polished. Everything about it was real. The Caldwell Futures Trust was hosting its annual scholarship gathering. Students and families filled the space, coats draped over chairs, laughter rising and falling without choreography. There was no dress code, no photographer waiting for the perfect angle, just people showing up as they were. Ava Lee moved through the room with purpose, clipboard tucked under her arm, stopping to greet nearly everyone by name. When she spotted me, her face lit up in a way that was unguarded and immediate. "You made it," she said, reaching for my hand. "I wouldn't miss it," I replied. She squeezed my fingers and smiled. "Come meet the new recipients. They've been asking about you." We walked together across the room. A young woman with nervous eyes thanked me 3 times before I could stop her. A father spoke about his daughter's plans for college, pride thick in his voice. I listened more than I spoke, the way I always had when something mattered. At one point, Ava leaned closer and said quietly, "You know, they ask if you're family." I raised an eyebrow. "And what do you tell them?" She smiled. "That family is who shows up." The words settled into me slowly, not as comfort, but as truth. Later, when the speeches were done and the chairs were being stacked, I found a seat near the window and watched the snow begin to fall. It looked the same as it had the year before. Soft, patient, uninterested in who noticed it. I thought about the Christmas when I sat alone at my dining table, convinced I had been left behind. The contrast was almost jarring. Then, silence had felt like absence. Now, it felt like peace. I realized something then that surprised me with its simplicity. I had not lost my family. I had stepped out of a structure that no longer saw me as a person. That distinction mattered more than I had ever allowed myself to admit. There was no moment of triumph, no victory speech waiting to be delivered. The satisfaction came from something quieter, from knowing that my value had never been up for negotiation, only misassigned. When I left the community center that night, Ava walked me to my car. "You okay?" she asked. I nodded. "I'm more than okay." She hesitated, then said, "I hope you know how much this means. Not just the money, the intention." I looked at her, really looked, and felt something warm settle in my chest. "I do," I said. "That's why I chose it." She smiled, a little emotional, then waved as I drove away. At home, I poured a glass of water and stood by the window watching the snowfall coat the street. There were no photos being taken, no posts being uploaded, and for the first time in years, I did not have the urge to document anything. I understood now that revenge had never been part of my story, not the kind that requires someone else to lose. The real shift happened when I stopped allowing others to define the shape of my life. Loneliness, I learned, does not come from being alone. It comes from being surrounded by people who no longer see you as human, only as useful. Once I stepped away from that, the quiet stopped hurting. If you are listening to this and you have ever been made to feel invisible, outdated, or quietly inconvenient, I want you to hear this clearly. Silence can be a form of preparation. Distance can be a form of clarity. And dignity is something no one gets to revoke. I did not raise my voice. I did not take anything away. I simply chose where my life would continue to grow. And that choice changed everything. I was never alone. I had just been waiting to stand in the right room.